right. Yeah, please do it. So, what we have for you today is a presentation by Professor Timothy Linch. So, Professor Linch is an emeritus professor from Mount St. Joseph's College in Cincinnati. Understands a huge amount, not just about this region, but about this story. And then also in his own research, he worked on work songs and labor songs and things of the nature of the common people and how we kind of rise up. So I think it's an apropos intro and kind of alignment in what we're doing. So please give yourselves the undivided attention, or please give the undivided attention to Professor Linch. He's going to be cooking, y'all, so let him do it.
Bears on it? I thought it was Chicago Bears, and we're going to get a lot of love. Well, welcome. As mentioned, I'm a teacher. I'm retired now. I'm a teacher for 43 years. I understand you're all educators, so you are my people. Let me tell you a little bit about this someone that I've just come to truly admire, Reverend John Rankin. John Rankin was born in eastern Tennessee in 1793, and in an area that he himself later describes as the wilderness. It was an interesting year for John Rankin to come into this world because 1793 is also the year when Congress passed the first fugitive slave law, a law that John Rankin would obstruct again and again and again. It's also the same year that Eli Whitney received a patent for his cotton gin, an invention that would cement black slave labor to the cotton south. But despite being born in, again, what he calls the wilderness, John Rankin's parents were both literate, and so a young John Rankin learned to read and write. But perhaps more importantly, from his mother, he learned to despise slavery. She believed it was absolutely evil and sinful and was not to be engaged. Well, because John Rankin was literate, he had the academic credentials to go on and study, and he attended Washington College in Tennessee. The school's no longer there. It went out of existence in 1922, but at the time it was the first college west of the Allegheny Mountains. And at Washington College, he fell under the influence of its founder and president, Dr. Samuel Doak. Dr. Doak was also an opponent of slavery, so he reinforced that lesson that John Rankin first learned at home. But perhaps more importantly for John Rankin, Dr. Doak was also the grandfather of the woman that John Rankin would marry. John and Jean Rankin would have 13 children. Yeah. He described his wife as a formidable vine. And if that wasn't enough, over the course of their life, they would raise another 7 as their own. So John Rankin, going to Washington College, he completes the course of study, and he stays on for additional training as a Presbyterian minister. And he's ordained a Presbyterian minister. And this is at a moment in America's history when the country is going through what historians refer to as the Second Great Awakening. Second, only to distinguish it from an earlier religious movement, but a religious movement that started on the very end of the 18th century and extended well into the 19th century. And characteristic of the Second Great Awakening were large camp meetings where people would come from miles around and hear sermons from ministers, fire and brimstone sermons, urging the congregants to renounce the sins in their own life and work to eradicate those sins in the world. And if that happened, that would hasten the second coming of Christ. Well, what did they consider sinful? Not keeping the Sabbath holy, drunkenness or intemperance, gambling. Interesting to say that today in Ripley. They haven't been up here. Maybe I'll go down there. And slavery. So a young minister preaching against all those things is sort of pulled aside by his superiors in the presbytery and said, perhaps you could tone down that business about slave ownership. You're in a slave state, as he well knew. Many of your congregants are slave owners, and they don't much care for being reminded of their sinfulness. Well, that was not in John Rankin's playbook. He was not going to modify what he said from the pulpit because it offends the sensibilities of some of the parishioners. And so he makes the decision with his wife that they're going to move to Ripley, Ohio. He'd heard that this community had been settled by anti-slavery folks, and that's where he wants to raise a family. He and his wife Jean have had their first child by then, and they begin to make the trek in horse and carriage from eastern Tennessee to Ripley. And as they do, they go through the communities of Lexington, Kentucky, and Paris, Kentucky, and they hear that there's need for a minister in Carlisle, Kentucky. Carlisle is about an hour's drive from here. And so John Rankin and his wife believe, well, perhaps we should put down roots there. And for 4 years, they will live in Carlisle, Kentucky, add 3 more children to their growing family. And he will also do something that perhaps doesn't get as much mention as it might. He opens up a school for slaves. He's gotten the okay of some of the slave owners, but many others in the community don't much care for it, and they bust up the school. He attempts to continue instruction in a friend's home, but the harassment continues. And so after living in Carlisle for about 4 years, they decide we're going to continue that trek towards Ripley, Ohio. And on the very first day of the year, 1822, they come into Ripley. And they have a home built right on the river, okay? Very close to where you're going to be when you go down to the Parker House. Literally, you could throw a rock from the Parker House property to this house that they built right on the river. It's referred to as the house with 3 doors, because it has 3 doors. But it was essentially a 3-unit apartment building. The Rankins lived in 1 unit, they rented out the other 2 for a little bit of income. While John Rankin and his wife and family are living still down in the village itself, in this house with 3 doors, John Rankin learns that his own brother, now living in Virginia, has become a slave owner. He's beside himself. His brother is engaging in sinful activity that could damn his mortal soul for eternity, a lesson that his mother had taught him years before, and now he's engaging in this sinful, evil activity. And John Rankin's trying to figure out how to communicate with his brother to convince him to liberate his slave. And he makes the decision he's going to write him letters, a series of letters. He writes them 13 letters from 1825 to 1826, exactly 200 years ago. And in these 13 letters, he explains to his brother the evil of slave ownership. Indeed, it's really quite fascinating, these letters, and this is a little pitch we have for sale in the gift store during intermission. But what's interesting is that he not only buttresses his own arguments against slave ownership by using the scripture, but he also takes to task those who would use scripture to defend the institution of slavery. I'm going to read you just 2 sentences from his very first letter to his brother Thomas. He writes, God has, referring to Acts of the Apostles, he says, God has made of one blood all nations of men. Whenever we find a man, let us treat him as a brother, without regard to his color. Let our kindness soothe his sorrows and cheer his heart. Would that we all abided by those 2 sentences. Well, his brother frees his slave. And John Rankin believes that perhaps it was the arguments he advanced in these letters. And by the way, these letters were sent to him as open letters in the local paper. Okay? And coincidentally, the editor of the local paper lived in one of the 2 units that the Rankins rented out in this house with 3 doors. And the best part is the name of the paper was The Castigator. And he was going to do some castigating of his brother. But his brother liberates his slave, and so John Rankin believes that perhaps these letters had the persuasion that could instill others to liberate their slaves. So he has 1,000 copies of these letters printed. He can only afford to have half of them bound, and he has the other half, the other 500, stored in a warehouse in Maysville, in Kentucky. There they mysteriously burn in a warehouse fire. Many believe because of the contents of the letters. Indeed, when you leave this room and you go out into this hallway, you're going to see a little bubble box display, and there's a small book. It's one of the 500 copies of the letters that he had. Well, this family that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger now has reached the size of 8 children. They need a little more space, and so they purchased some 40, 50, 60 acres up on this hilltop, and they have that home built. The construction was led by Gene Rankin's brother, and it started in 1828, and it's completed in 1829. The Rankins will live in their home then from 1829 all the way until 1866. Now, why John Rankin and the rest of the family leave, some of the children had already left the area, but why they sell the home and leave Ripley in 1866, it's not clear. Perhaps it's the thought that the Civil War has defeated slavery in battle, and the need for a conductor on the Underground Railroad is no longer necessary. He's also 73 at the time, and so perhaps he just thinks it's time to take his ease. But for whatever reason, in 1866, the home is sold to another family. I say that because the home will be in other private hands from 1866 all the way until 1938, when the state of Ohio will acquire the property. 38 is the end of the Depression, then we have the war years, so the state of Ohio is sitting on that property for about 10 years. It's first opened for visits in 1948, so it's been open 77 years. But the Rankins have moved out of the area, so appreciate that when you go through the home, that all the virtually all the furnishings are of the time period of the Rankins, but none of the furnishings are the Rankins. The only possessions we have on site that were actually the Rankins is a copy of those letters that I pointed out, and then in the case you may have seen the Bible. It's that's the Bible that John Rankin brought from Tennessee in 1793. And it's called a preacher's Bible or a teacher's Bible, in that there's notes about the reading that are part of the book itself. So they move into this house in 1829, and it's the home you're about to tour through. But I want to tell you the most important story connected with that house. And it takes us back to February of 1838. A little town downriver a couple miles on the Kentucky side, Dover. There's a young woman who's enslaved. And one day she overhears her owner talking to a slave salesman about an impending sale. And she thinks it's involving her, and that sale will result in her being separated from her child. And so she makes the brave decision to run, knowing full well that if she's caught, she's certainly going to be separated from her child. But she makes the brave decision to run, and she comes towards Ripley on the Kentucky side of the river. It's February, and appreciate that the Ohio River today is a much different animal than it was in John Rankin's day. We're in our second generation of locks and dams. The 981 miles of Ohio River is it's a working river 365 days of the year. In John Rankin's time, there were no locks, there were no dams. In the summertime, if it was particularly dry, you could wade across the river. And in the wintertime, ice often formed on it. It's February 1838, and this young woman with child in arms begins to cross on the river on the ice. She doesn't go too many steps when the ice fails to hold her weight and she's plunged into the cold water. She pulls herself up, gets up on another slab of ice, happens again. How many times she had to pull herself out of that icy water and pull herself back up onto a slab of ice, we don't know, but she does get to the Ohio side of the river. And there's a man waiting for her. His name's Chancey Shaw. And he's doing what he had done many other times. He's patrolling the banks of the river with the idea that under the cover of night, particularly with a little ice on the river, fugitives might try to cross, and he could grab one up, take it back into Kentucky, and collect the reward. And appreciate, rewards could be substantial. Some could be as high as $500 or more, and that would be a full year's income for a well-paid worker. But this man, this Chancey Shaw, has watched this woman struggle with her child in arms to get across, falling again and again and again into the icy cold water. And he says to her in so many words, any person that's willing to put themselves, what I just saw you putting yourself through, deserves her freedom. And he points to this house, the Rankin house, and he says, the man in that home will help you. She lets herself in through the kitchen door, which the Rankins had left unlocked for occasions like this. And as the Reverend later recounts in his autobiography, she stirs a fire in the fireplace, and the Reverend and his wife wake up. They get the woman and her child a hot meal. They dry her clothes out, and they get a couple of sons to get horses from the barn and get them off to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. Okay, why are those two deserving of such mention? John Rankin lays claim to having assisted, and hear this number right, over 2,000 get to freedom through that home. None of them being caught. What makes these two so special? Well, John Rankin will recount the story I just told you to a colleague of his in Cincinnati, another Presbyterian minister. His name is Lyman Beecher. And that story that John Rankin would tell Lyman Beecher would be related to Lyman Beecher's daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe would take those two real live human beings and turn them into two characters in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, okay, so two of the over 2,000 that John Rankin helps make it into a book. Okay, that's nice. Well, it ain't just any book. That book was a bestseller. It first came out in 1851 in what's called serial form, a chapter a week, and they ran it in an abolitionist newspaper. It was extraordinarily popular. The next year, she has it bound as, actually, it took two bindings to put it into one book, and it becomes an immediate bestseller. It's, in fact, in the entire 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin is second in sales only to one other book. Anybody want to guess the other book? The Bible. Absolutely. So this book is being bought. By 1857, it's been translated into 20 languages. It'll be the first novel in English translated into Chinese. It is having an extraordinary effect on attitudes of Americans and Europeans towards slavery. Because if you, at that time, if you'd have lived in Hartford, Connecticut, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Boston, Massachusetts, or my hometown, Chicago, Illinois, you would have heard about slavery, but maybe what you heard was what slave owners were advancing, that it's a benevolent institution. It takes good care of those who otherwise wouldn't be able to care for themselves. Well, that ain't the picture of slavery that comes through in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's an evil, sinful, degrading institution, what John Rankin had always claimed it to be. And its significance in altering opinion, not only in the North, but in Europe, is huge. Indeed, many don't appreciate that at the time of the American Civil War, the Confederacy hoped that England was going to come to its aid. They believed that was going to happen because the Union had blockaded southern ports to keep southern cotton in the South and not allow the South to make money from its number one crop. And the Confederacy is believing that Great Britain will run that blockade, enter the war on the side of the Confederacy so as to assure their mills of having an adequate supply of cotton. Well, there's a lot of reasons why England doesn't enter the American Civil War. For one, they had dropped slavery in their own realm in the 1830s, but their population has also been reading this book that, again, depicts slavery not as some benevolent institution that helps those who couldn't help themselves, but as an evil, sinful practice that has to be obliterated. Whether or not this story is true, or whether or not it's apocryphal, we don't know. But the story goes that when the Civil War began, President Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the story goes that he said to her, "So you're the little lady that wrote that book that started this great war." Now, did Lincoln believe that Uncle Tom's Cabin started that quick? No, by no means. But it does speak to the significance of that book. So when you go through the home, and you get into that front sitting room with the box stove, and you're going to see we have something of a prop there, a wash bucket with what's to be what a slave woman might have worn. When you're in that room, take stock. Take stock. Appreciate what happened in there. Some woman that was so afraid she was going to be separated from her own child was brave enough to leave that farm, brave enough to step up on ice that wouldn't hold her, and that here she was in that room shivering, probably worried that the dogs you could hear baying in the distance were on her trail, and if she was caught, for sure she was going to be separated from her child. But think of that brave act. She didn't want to make it in the book. That wasn't her design. But think of how that life then played itself out and the significance that she would play in the world, in history. And here's a nice little postscript to that same story. A couple years after she first arrived at the Rankin's house in 1838, I think it was 3 years later, she comes back. She comes back to the home. She's got a white man with her, a Canadian. She's made it all the way to Canada. She's made it where there is no slavery. And yet she's come back and she's got a plan. The Canadian is going to get himself hired on at the farm where she had been enslaved. And he's going to communicate with others in her family to effect a second escape. Wow. And they do. There was one member of the family that they were not able to communicate with because the woman was a house servant and they could not get word to her. But the rest of the family, wow. A couple years ago, this book came out, Bound for Canaan, the epic story of the Underground Railroad, America's first civil rights movement.
The girl, Liza Harris, is that who that is?
Pardon?
The girl from the story that you just told her, that's Liza Harris?
Yes, that's
okay.
Yes. This book came out a few years ago, and when it first came out, it was in hardback, and when it went to paperback, the author added a preface, and he made these comments about Underground Railroad sites, of which you're about to visit, I think, arguably one of the most Well, I work here, but I really like the place. But appreciate the difference between this and many other Underground Railroad sites you might see this week, in that everybody knew what the Rankins were up to. People knew what that house meant. But here's what Fergus Bodwich writes about this site. He says, there is a profound modesty to Underground Railroad sites. Almost all of them are private homes or churches. Unlike a battlefield, there are no cannons or battle maps to dramatize what took place there. No marble obelisks or statues to celebrate the dead. The activities of the Underground Railroad were homely and private. A knock on the door, a bed offered, a horse saddled. Dramatic only in retrospect, when their sum total can be seen to have been a movement of epic proportion. A few sites have been preserved in ways that capture something of the ambiance of antebellum America. More than any other single place, it seems to me, the spirit of the heroes of the Underground Railroad resides in the home of the Reverend John Rankin and his passionately abolitionist family, where it stands proudly on a steep hill overlooking the town of Ripley, Ohio. Below it, the landscape still spreads out as majestically as it did before the Civil War. The Ohio River, wider now, still winds westward towards the Mississippi, the ultimate watershed between freedom and slavery for countless enslaved African Americans. It is a plain, even austere home, a fitting monument to this Presbyterian minister who received and forwarded perhaps 2,000 fugitive slaves between the 1820s and the Civil War. Rankin chose this site deliberately. Here, for all to see, his house was a beacon to the fugitive and a blunt, deliberate provocation to slave hunters who more than once attacked it with armed force. Here, embodied in the Rankin home, is the real spirit of the Underground Railroad. Not buried underground in a tunnel, but bold and unashamed, defiant and willing to fight. Thank you.